get started with some introductions, and then we'll get going. So what I envision for this is that we just kind of have a conversation. Each of our wonderful public historians can present for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I will open the floor to questions, and our panelists can each answer, whatever you feel like you would like to answer, or however you'd like to answer. And if I could ask everybody who is here in the webinar to definitely mute yourself. And for any questions you have, if you could type them in the Q&A, that is the best place to write your questions. And I will try to get to all of those and facilitate this. And so without further ado, I'll kind of introduce myself and our panel, and then I'll introduce each participant before they talk to us today. So I'm Kathryn Julian. I'm an assistant professor of history at Westminster College in Salt Lake City. I'm new to the Salt Lake area. We just moved during the pandemic, so haven't met everybody there. It's a strange virtual year. And so our panel today is looking at a really important issue, local history as public advocacy. And I think this comes as no revelation to many of us who do public-facing historical work, that history isn't neutral. It never has been. It isn't now. That hasn't changed. And I think in the past few years in particular, historians have played an increasing role in activism and advocacy-oriented work, whether it's through museum spaces, community restoration projects, organizing, kind of grassroots on the ground education, amplifying marginalized voices, or environmental activism as well. So our panelists are going to explore the important role and the limitations of historians who work at this intersection of local history and public advocacy. So our first panelist in the roundtable today is Holly George. She is a senior state historian at Utah Division of State History and co-editor of the Utah Historical Quarterly. And she is the author of Showtown, Theater and Culture in the Pacific Northwest, and received her PhD from the University of Washington. So Holly, take it away.
Thank you. And I get to do the awkward screen share thing right now. Okay, I'm gonna share these. Just a minute, please. Okay. Here we go. All right. Okay, thank you for being here. Again, Holly George with the Utah Division of State History. In the late summer of 2020, our administrators charged our division with developing products for the 125th anniversary of Utah's statehood, which occurred in January. Dr. Wendy Rexatzet, who manages K-12 programs in our division, suggested a film. Because of COVID, she knew teachers needed something ready to use for remote and physical environments. So we decided on a video. We wanted some animation in it, and we had about 3 months to do it. So as we worked to develop this video, we had two major questions. And when I say we, I'm the least of the team, just props to other people. First question was, how could we introduce what was a frankly very arcane and fraught subject about why it took Utah 50 years almost to become a state? And second, how could we broaden the narrative to help kids of all backgrounds see themselves in this history? So I'm going to start with the first question. I've got slides. Okay, so question of political statehood. Whoops. The basic point here is that Utahns advocated for statehood for almost 50 years, and it took so long because of really complex reasons, rooted in religious prejudice and a political system in Utah that wasn't fair to everyone here. But like, how do you teach that to 4th and 7th graders? And I'm not an educator, so, how do you teach that? And also, not all the tensions are gone. We still got tensions here in Utah. And also, we're a state agency. We're ultimately answerable to the state legislature in a very conservative state. So logistically, we knew we would need help. It was a 3-month project. So we brought on Dr. Cassie Clark, a Utah historian, and Emma Moss, a middle school social study teacher. And with Wendy, they were the core creators of this content I'm talking about. We decided our film was going to be a mixture of animation, period images, and artifacts. And one example from the process that really illustrates the struggle comes with the subject of polygamy and the artifact of political cartoons. So the Latter-day Saint practice of polygamy, of course, was one of the major reasons that Utah was denied statehood for so many years. And it's a really difficult subject for a lot of Utahns still. But you can't skip it. You can't skip it and tell the story. So how are we going to bring this up with middle school audiences? When we were having meetings this summer, somebody mentioned political cartoons, and this is immediately what I imagined. This picture of Brigham Young in bed with all the ladies and angry moms calling us. Like, we can't do that. Well, we did decide on doing political cartoons, and we did decide on polygamy cartoons. And one really important concern Lisa Barr, another colleague, brought up was there are still present day polygamous families in Utah. We didn't want to marginalize those kids. So how do we do this sensitively? I've got a clip here from the wonderful Paul Reeve at the University of Utah. Here's what we did in the film. And I'm gonna full screen this. Okay. Is it going to work? Okay, here we go.
Well, the key issues preventing statehood centered on Mormon cultural practices that seemed un-American to many non-Mormons.
The statehood debates made it clear that those in Utah, according to those in Congress, were not American. They weren't true Americans because they were doing things that were deemed un-American. They were engaged in polygamy, and there was an overlap between party politics and religious faith. And as long as Congress looked in on Utah and saw those two things in operation, they continually rejected Utah's application for statehood.
Okay. All right. So again, Utah's being rejected for these reasons because people are seen as un-American. Well, okay. So we did end up using political cartoons, and we just one, I think. But we didn't feel safe like putting those in the classroom, especially in 2020, without a lot of context. So this is really where it helped having teachers on board. Emma and Wendy especially, and Cassie, came up with a lesson plan or 3 lesson plans on 3 of the biggest, I guess, meaty, hard issues in the video, and then a contextual essay. Here's the cartoon we ended up using, Scenes in an American Harem. And so we had a bunch of teaching tools to go along with it to put things in context. Not me, I didn't do this. Other people did this, did breakout like analysis of the cartoon for the teachers, for the kids. Like, I really like this label here pointing out, okay, this is labeled Scenes in an American Harem. And so just pointing out to the teachers, to the kids, this is a stereotype of foreign cultures. This is othering all sorts of people who don't fit in with this Protestant cultural norm. There's a lot of exaggeration in this cartoon, showing women and girls kind of being fed into a sexual slavery system. It's exaggeration. And what I really like about the tools they developed for this is, something we've been saying a lot lately in our division, that the tools that you teach kids with history are ones that are completely applicable to living our lives right now, to decoding the media right now and social media and figuring things out and having a critical mindset. So our other big question was, how could we make this story fit, like relevant at all to kids? Utah today is home to a lot of different people. We've got about 60,000 refugees in the state right now. We have schools where, there are 30 languages spoken, and a lot of people who don't have roots in the territorial era. And we want them to watch this and say, like, I matter to this still. I belong in Utah. So, and again, the political statehood story is kind of hard to decipher, to figure out. So our answer to all of that was to widen the lens on the story and to make it not just about this process of political statehood and the political leaders, but to deliberately make it a story of the many communities who lived in Utah, who built Utah, whether or not they had a political voice. We show it through the title, Becoming Utah, A People's Journey, and a lot of maps and photographs talking about the participation of African-American women in politics at the turn of the century in Utah, about our immigrant communities who came here to work in mines. And the film was very straightforward about Euro-American settlement and the impact that had on Native communities. And to the point of this panel, we felt really strongly about deliberately drawing a connection between the exclusions and harassments of the statehood era of all different kinds and the xenophobia of today. We felt really strongly about including that, even if we got angry calls from parents. So I'm going to end with a clip from the video, and the historians here are Sandra Jones and again, Paul Reeve. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Okay, full screen and play.
How does this impact you? What do we learn from the story of statehood?
Well, what happened to Utah's indigenous people, the way they were legislated against and forgotten, and had to fight and claw and go to court in order to gain the same rights and privileges as other Utahns. This should help us all appreciate how important our own rights as citizens are in the state of Utah.
So that we can hopefully stand in places of empathy for those who in the 21st century are being defined outside of the bounds of what it means to be an American. Are we drawing lines religiously for other immigrant groups, such as Muslims coming to the United States? Are we drawing lines racially for those who are marginalized in the United States? Or are we willing to stretch our definition of who we the people are to include all people?
We learned from Utah's history that statehood was the work of many individuals, not just a small group of politicians, business, or church leaders. People from all over the world came together here and built Utah through their work, families, and communities. In the process, they learned that they had to look beyond their differences to build a more fair, just, and inclusive state. This did not end in 1896. It continues to this day. You can honor those who first built Utah by sharing your voice and by listening to those who may not be heard.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks, Holly. That was great. And K through 12 is that's such a formative place where a lot of this work can start. So really important. So everyone hold those questions in your mind until the end for Holly, and we'll keep it rolling, keep our conversation rolling, and then we can have an open conversation. So our next panelist is Jedediah Rogers, and he is currently co-editor of Utah Historical Quarterly and a senior state historian with the Utah Division of State History. And he is the author of Roads in the Wilderness, Conflict in Canyon Country, and co-editor of The Earth Will Appear as the Garden of Eden, essays on Mormon environmental history. I really need to get my hands on that book. That sounds fascinating. And his current book project is an environmental history of the Great Salt Lake. So take it away, Jed.
All right, thank you, Kathryn. So you'll notice that I have the same title as Holly George. So you'll get your full dose of Utah history through our panels. I'm really grateful to be here today, and especially for the other panelists, and to have this conversation. You know, there have been times when I felt like I've had to compartmentalize my historical work with whatever activist tendencies I may have, but I have tried to consciously carve out a research agenda that sort of is in dialogue somewhat with some of my social concerns, policy concerns. My chosen field of study is environmental history, and like some other fields that came out of the social sensibilities of the 1960s and 70s, is directly linked to advocacy, and in this case, the environmental movement. So, you know, my my current work on the Great Salt Lake with Jeff Nichols at Westminster, precisely because we fear the lake is drying up. We want to raise attention to that fact. Perhaps others will take notice. So there's a inseparability between what I do as a historian and how I choose to act in the world. And yet I fully recognize that history has its own set of methodologies and questions that don't always perfectly map into other contexts. So my hunger for this particular conversation stems because I believe that history ought to be put to work in the world, but it's not always clear to me how this is to be done. Since there are limits to what history can or cannot say about present. We can talk about some of those. And I am well aware that within our discipline, there's a tradition perhaps to avoid any kind of direct discussion of advocacy, and especially perhaps political advocacy. And it's nice to see in recent years that those walls have really been tumbling down. And that's the case at the institution where Holly and I, the Utah State Historical Society, Utah Division of State History, there have been instances where it feels like we have been censored to a degree, but I feel like there's been a sea change, especially in recent years, in which we've been really encouraged to address head-on difficult aspects of our history, as Holly has demonstrated, to connect that history to public policy and contemporary issues. And so this is the kind of work of advocacy that I think is important. Like many other organizations, in the wake of the George Floyd murders, we've started to notice our blind spots, evaluate our internal culture, survey our publications, what we've written, identify concrete ways to make our organization more diverse, more relevant. And one exciting initiative that I thought I would mention is our ongoing work that we've just begun to address racism and sort of racial discrimination. We have a talented historian, Amanda Schuerman, working on what we're calling digests that address housing and zoning, healthcare, criminal justice, education. And the direct audience for these products is the governor, the legislature, decision makers in the state. And so it seems like we are making concerted steps to see history as a means to advocate in the institution where I work. And yet, as I've mentioned before, I'm weary still of landmines when wading into very public policy matters as a state employee in a very conservative state. I just wanted, in the time that I have today, to bring up an example that I was involved with tangentially, but that illustrates some of what I'm talking about here and what we're talking about. Just outside of Moab, Utah is a side canyon of the Colorado River, previously known as Negro Bill Canyon, now known as Grandstaff Canyon. And those of you in Utah may remember that we had public conversations, debates about whether the name of this canyon ought to have been changed. The namesake is William Grandstaff, who apparently came into the Moab area in the 1870s. He's listed on the 1880 census as a farmer, but most historical accounts actually refer to his occupation as a rancher and prospector, probably ran cattle in his namesake canyon. Grandstaff's family ancestry is difficult to attain. My good friend, Katrina Robison, has done a little bit of research on this, but we find that in the 1880 census, for example, that there's listed a William Grandstair in eastern Emery County, who's listed as Black. In 1937, History of Moab characterized Grandstaff as, quote, a mulatto Negro. And other sources have referred to him as having some Native American or European ancestry. But in any case, legend has it that in 1881, locals from Moab suspected that Grandstaff was selling liquor to local Native peoples. And when that same year, so he was actually William Grandstaff was driven out of the Moab area. And he reportedly said, quote, the men are gathering up guns to hunt Indians, and I think maybe I'm the Indian they're after. So Grandstaff then becomes the namesake for two public landmarks in the West. the canyon in Moab that I've mentioned, and also a prominent cross on Red Mountain, just outside of Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where he died. The derogatory variant of Negro Bill was attached to the canyon almost immediately after Grandstaff was driven out. And it lasted into the 1960s when the name was changed to Negro Bill Canyon, kind of as part of a nationwide effort to rename places by the National Board on Geographical Names. So when we talk about history and advocacy, it seems to me that we ought to consider, history for whom, advocacy for what. Place names like historical monuments and statues represent a layering of collective memory that offers a particular image of the past, one that's often self-consciously created to meet the needs of an individual or group. And our physical landscape is made up of these inherited layers in which certain perspectives, ideologies, cultural worldviews dominate other ones, right? And I'm not certain what precisely the name Negro Bill and the earlier highly derogatory variant meant to locals in Moab. But what's clear is that those names have been part of the layers that have formed a local cultural identity. And the thing about place names is that their ubiquity almost makes them appear to be benign fixtures on the landscape, but of course that's not the case. They obscure, they distort, they hide, they give meaning and identity to people who associate with them, usually the locals. And far from being God ordained, of course, place names are contingent, they're subject to change. So this is one thing where historians can certainly advocate by considering the histories embedded in names, the impact of these names, and the ways to move forward that are more inclusive. So just briefly, I want to comment on how we went from Negro Bill Canyon to Grandstaff Canyon, because I think it highlights how difficult this process can be and how issues raised by place names are not always clear-cut. When the proposed name change first came before the Board on Geographical Names in 1999, the committee registered no support to change the name among the various groups who were queried. And the committee subsequently voted against a proposed name change. This meant that the same name couldn't be proposed again unless one of the organizations that were originally queried had changed their position. So the issue of name change came up in the 2010s, and the Grand County Council voted several times to retain the name Negro Bill. And the Salt Lake branch of the NAACP actually went on record in the media in support of the name because they didn't see it as offensive and, quote, it was a point of pride as it makes it clear that the canyon was named for a Black historical figure. Then in January 2017, the Grand County Council and the Bureau of Land Management reversed its position and voted to support changing the name to Grandstaff Canyon. And this triggered a process whereby the name was officially considered by the board. And I'm sorry, we're not going to have time to get into the details of how this played out, but in short, the Utah Board on Geographical Names narrowly voted against changing the name, while the National Board on Geographical Names overturned the state decision and voted for a name change. So I raise this, I think, for a couple of reasons. First, advocacy for me suggests a kind of intimacy and familiarity. I'm not from Moab, but like many other out-of-towners, I feel a connection to the town and also to the canyon. I've recreated in it, I've even written about it. And so when the name change came up in 2017, for whatever reason, I felt somewhat invested. I spoke to my good friend and colleague, who's chair of the state's Geographical Names Committee, and we were trying to feel out the contours of this debate, and especially to understand how history would play into the decision to either change the name or not. And frankly, scrutinizing my own feelings, I remember initially privileging the idea to preserve the original name, and partly on the basis the name gave attention to a Black man, as the NAACP had argued. But I'll note here that the Martin Luther King Jr. Commission strongly opposed the name Negro Bill and advocated in favor of a name change. So I soon changed my position. After all, Negroville was not the original name of the canyon, and so it didn't seem necessary to overly privilege it, right? This idea that the land, as Edward Abbey used to say, that the land ought to be kept as it was, I'm just not convinced by such thinking. I think we ought to be thoughtful about who and what we enshrine in public spaces. And the canyon name change has also been a reminder to me to pay attention to how people of color are inscribed on the landscape and in the histories we tell. This is something my previous work on environmental conflict on the Colorado Plateau didn't adequately do. So I've since dug a bit deeper into what sources we have on the life of William Grandstaff, who, like all people we write about and commemorate, deserves to be seen as fully human in his complexity. And I'll just mention here the good work being done by Greg Smoke, NCPH president, and his graduate students at the American West Center to map, in this case, indigenous names, place names, in an effort to restore native place names to the map of Utah and the Intermountain West. So to close, I'm not sure there's a code or a handbook that directs us on where and how to advocate, but it's clear that many of us clearly feel compelled to do so where we can. The historian Theodore Karamanski has written that, quote, "The good historian results in the fusion of personal ethics and professional ethics," end quote. So to the extent that our personal ethics are baked into what we do as historians, I think it's important to bring attention to the marriage between our professional work and our personal values. And I think that doing so will help us open doors for us to sit on at the table of conversations that are happening regarding public policy. It will bring more relevance to our work. And certainly it'll help to share and hear voices of individuals that have otherwise been ignored or not taken seriously. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jed. You raised some really, I think, urgent questions that we can circle back to at the end with our questions. But yeah, I love this idea of physical landscapes having these layered identities that, as historians, we can kind of speak to some of those and flesh those out. And this idea of can we advocate as outsiders too? I have a lot of questions. We'll come back, but thank you so much, Jed. So up next, we'll have Angela Tate. Angela is the incoming curator of women's history at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Congrats, Angela. This is a new position and that's incredible. It sounds like a dream job. So she is completing right now her doctorate at Northwestern University, but is proud to have received her public history training at Cal State San Bernardino. Her previous experiences are very far-flung, ranging from a Chinatown Historic Preservation Organization to a NASA facility to a small schoolhouse museum in the Chicago suburbs. So you've done it all. But all are tied together by her passion for exploring the connections between different cultures and communities in the United States. So very relevant, kind of a nice tie-in to what Jed was just speaking to as well. So take it away, Angela.
Oh, thank you for that amazing introduction. And yes, that new position fell in between beginning this panel and putting together all the bios. So I'm glad that I can share the celebration with everyone at this conference, which has been very vital to my conception of myself as a public historian, as well as an academic historian and a teacher. So current events have made me zero into the fact that my story as a public historian has been about various communities that reside in the United States. And a lot of my experience has been in small local organizations, local museums, historic preservation projects, park sites, as well as family and personal archives and their relationships with formal institutions, which has led me to really feel that advocacy is at the center of my work. Advocacy for people who have been marginalized in these museum spaces, people who have been marginalized in collection spaces with major institutions such as one of the family archives that I worked on, they wanted to have their papers housed in their alma mater. Their alma mater had no interest in these papers. And so it made me think very deeply about what is the purpose of collecting and the purpose of creating these archives, and why institutions might not want to collect particular people's papers and their collections, and what does that mean for what the institution wants to represent about itself when it determines what it does and does not want to collect. And then other formal institutions have been very interesting for me as a woman of color, entering into museums that have traditionally not hired people of color. And Jed talking about a place that was called Negro reminded me of a museum that I worked in Southern California. It was formerly, up until maybe about 2010, it was very rural, mostly populated by ranches. And then because of the building up of San Diego, a lot of people started moving out to this region, and it became very densely populated with homes and retail spaces. And they did not actually adjust to the differences in the demographic changes. And I remember being in this museum, and longtime residents of the museum would stop in and say, "Oh, do you remember that?" I remember that this place was called such and such Negro. And of course, I knew why they came to me to tell me this point of interest. They wanted to know my responses to why this was named Negro. And at one point, I ended up looking up a couple books that we had in our gift shop about this region, and it had the former derogatory name listed right in the book. They had not changed any reprintings. They had had this long time journal from the 60s and the 70s that they did not update. And so I had to think about, like, what does it mean for this institution, which was also owned by the city, to not feel the need to update language and terminology to reflect the changing demographics, why they felt it was okay to hire me in this space without letting me know that this is how some longtime residents would respond to my presence in this museum. And also, there was an extensive exhibit to the local Native American communities in this museum that I learned about 4 or 5 months into working in this museum that they were not impressed with and they were not happy about. And the museum and the city was not interested in reaching out and having any kind of connection with them to redo this exhibition or take it down or have any kind of conversation around them taking control of this exhibition. And so just thinking very deeply about these spaces have these particular narratives that they want to advocate to attract a particular kind of visitor. And when a trained public historian enters these spaces, a lot of the time they want your training, but they don't want your advocacy. They want you to be able to fix their collections and create a new collections management policy because previous employees were not trained, but they don't want you to say, hey, there's something wrong with this, or maybe we should reach out to this community because I don't think this is the correct interpretation of their history. And realizing that working in a museum or working in a space is not about objects, or sometimes it's not even about visitors. It can be a lot about bureaucracy and the narratives that the city wants to tell about itself. And when you are in this space, there's extra work required in learning that, oh, I have to navigate bureaucracy as well as typical museum practices, as well as audience responses and what they hope that this museum reflects about them. Because in this particular institution, they also had an extensive historic site next to the museum that also fed into this Disneyfication of their past, in that they were more interested in bringing tourists in to think about this place as a playground, wild, wild west kind of site for people to visit and to take children on field trips and walking tours, as opposed to being very deeply reflective of what this Western history was in California. Who was being erased? What was the violence? Why was there so much violence in this area? Why were the particular communities, like the Native American communities and the Chinese American immigrant communities, why they kept being pushed further and further away from this strip that has now been turned into a tourist attraction. And also other smaller museums that I've worked with. I will say, like, the most recent experience I've had moving to Illinois in this small schoolhouse museum in a suburb of Chicago. Once again, the first person of color hired by this museum, and not fully understanding that while the demographics had shifted very much from when this city was founded in the post-World War II era, the actual interpretation was very much rooted in the early 20th century, which is when the original family settled in the area from Indiana. And I remember a visitor stopping me and saying, why is the Native American exhibit on the ground floor facing the bathrooms? And coming from California, it's not perfect, but there is a little bit more awareness of the Native American communities in California. Moving to the Midwest and realizing that that narrative of the vanishing Indian is very much prevalent in these spaces, and seeing that that was reflected in why this small, tiny part of this museum was on the ground floor facing a bathroom, and no one had ever questioned it until I started working there. So I would say there is this, I guess, this weirdness behind when a person of color enters into museum spaces that have been traditionally white, then people feel comfortable questioning some of the interpretive practices, some of the misinterpretations, some of the unfair and unequal narratives that these institutions perpetuate. But then at the same time, that has created an extra burden for me to think about, well, I'm going to be the voice that has to advocate for this. And that kind of puts the burden on me of being the spokesperson for representing communities of color or other marginalized communities. And what does that mean when it's always going to be the person of color who's going to take the lead on this conversation, particularly when the person of color, such as myself, was not hired for this. So I'm really, even though advocacy is my main through line, I also think that advocacy involves learning that you are also part of the conversation if you don't belong to this particular demographic, or you might not belong to this marginalized community, but also not putting the burden on people of color to be the ones to speak out all the time when they are in these positions. And I can also really think deeply about, again, like the layers of bureaucracy that occur when these kinds of conversations pop up when you're in these spaces. Again, it's not about collections, it's not about visitors, it's also about, there are also governments, city governments, state park districts, city park districts, city councils, and federal governments that are deeply invested in maintaining what the narrative is. And to be an advocate in this kind of region and in this space involves a lot more extra work than what I feel a lot of public history programs train students to know and to do. And if I was not thrown into all of these experiences, I would not have known that. And so I think there are multiple layers of advocacy. You need to learn that this is going to be a part of your position as a public historian while you are taking these intro to public history or intro to oral history courses. You need to learn about how to navigate these different kinds of entities, your city government, your state government, your county government, park districts, and also community stakeholders. A lot of my experience has also been navigating community stakeholders, whether they were on the board or whether they were volunteers or whether they were just visitors. And a lot of the times they were visitors that I did not expect that they would come to me and feel like I was the person to tell their grievances about this space too, whether it was because they thought I was changing the narrative too much and pushing for change, or whether they thought this was wrong and so what are you going to do about it? And again, I was just one lone employee, and a lot of the times I was the only employee at a small site, and it was going to be my voice against the voice of all the rest of the employees who never saw anything wrong with these narratives and with these sites. And so I think that there needs to be a lot more care and attention paid to what it means to be an advocate as a public historian. I know that I've seen a couple more other conversations where advocacy and history is seen as being a little bit too political, but I think that history is always going to be political, and the uses that everyone makes of history is political. And when you decide to visit a museum or a site or a historic park, that's part of wanting to confirm or wanting to reflect your own political biases and your own political beliefs about history. And I think that that is something that everyone should always pay attention to and be aware of. And as public historians, particularly emerging public historians, I think it's very important to think of yourself as an advocate for history and as an advocate for the community and for the different kinds of burdens that may be placed upon you that you don't expect. And I think that we should be more aware of the fact that it is more than, again, collections or doing interpretation. It's also what is being reflected about this site today that people are going to bring with them when they come visit or when they come talk to you. And how can you also build in a level of care and intentionality when you are in these spaces that will help you navigate these different entities that are going to have conflicting agendas when they approach you as one single person. And I've learned over the course of my experiences, and now that I'm moving into a much, much larger institution, that it's not my job to solve the problems. I have particular goals, and I think that I shouldn't have that burden placed on me, and it should be a team effort. And that when you move into this space as an individual, you should always think about who are my allies, how am I going to strategize to build a connection across different people and different stakeholders, so that it's not always going to be on you. And particularly as a person of color, when someone sees you as the voice of being able to say, oh, this is wrong, or I don't believe that this is correct, or as is my experience with someone coming to share a story about a derogatory name, like how can you build in that kind of intentionality and care for yourself, and also amongst your coworkers and your superiors and also your subordinates sometimes, so that you are able to have space to advocate for yourself while also not harming yourself. And I think that this conversation is so important to me because of all of these experiences and hearing everyone speak about their experiences, and just in general, just connection and community is the most important part of advocating for yourself and advocating for the community and the stakeholders that you may encounter while you are working as a public historian. Thank you.
Wow, yeah, thanks, Angela. Jamie in chat said that this could be a whole NCPH session in itself, and that's absolutely true. There's so much that I want to come back to here, and something that we, especially as white public historians, need to be very cognizant of. We don't want to overburden people. This is something I've been thinking about in my new job at Westminster College too. Like, we are like, everybody does this, like, oh, well, here's a Latino woman, let's ask her to be on this committee. Like, oh, well, let's get this person in just because they're a different, like it's an Asian American guy. And that's not fair to put the burden on our colleagues like that. Like, we need to do the advocacy work ourselves. And then the other thing that struck me so much here is, negotiating these community stakeholders, which is, you're absolutely right. This is not something that we're trained to do at all. Like, we always talked about like accessibility and museums, and we didn't really have these deep discussions that, monuments and museums themselves are very colonial. And so, like, even entering those spaces are problematic, and you're going to immediately be dealing with all of these political entities and community stakeholders and, people who want to promote their narrative. And especially working at government institutions, but also colleges and other white supremacist institutions. But anyway, great, thank you. We'll have lots of questions from all of these. All right, so next up, our final panelist is Lacey Wilson, who is the site manager for the Charlotte Hawkins Brown State Historic Site in Gibsonville, North Carolina, where she is honored to continue to tell the story of Dr. Brown and the Palmer Memorial Institute. Lacey holds an MA in history with a concentration in museum studies from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and her bachelor's in history from UMBC. Prior to the Hawkins Brown site, Lacey worked as a historic interpreter at the Owens Thomas House and slave quarters in Savannah, Georgia. So you've been in a lot of different local communities too. She educated visitors about economics and politics and urban slavery from the 1810s to the 1850s. And this work was highlighted in the New York Times and NPR's 1A radio show. She is an active member of the National Council of Public History, where she serves on the Advocacy Committee and the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So you're busy. Additionally, Lacey is an active member of the Black Interpreters Guild, promoting Black interpreters' work across this country. So without further ado, here's Lacey.
I had forgotten how long the bio was that I sent in. I am honored to be, I'm honored to be here with all of these panelists. And I feel like me and Angela right after each other makes a lot of sense given the things that she was talking about as well. So I will be talking about the job I hold currently and the previous job I just had in ways that I was able to create advocacy moments within public history. So before accepting the job as the historic interpreter, as one of the many historic interpreters at the Owens Thomas House and slave quarters, I had gotten my certificate as an interpretive guide through a program with the Association for African American Museums, the International Association for Interpretation, and the new, it's always new to me, the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History and Culture. They created a program where professionals from across the country were able to become certified interpretive guides. And there I connected with a lot of Black interpreters across the country and was able to join a revitalization of the guild that exists today and allows us to network with each other. So that's where I learned I got a lot of my interpretive training at that program, at that particular program, but the connections I made after that with interpreters throughout the country in terms of talking about various concerns that we all have and ways that we've dealt with various interactions with visitors and staff and institutions were all very helpful in me in terms of preparing me before I actually accepted the job. I got the job right out of grad school and I was excited to be employed. And Savannah was a new city for me. I didn't have any immediate family in the area. And I was excited to tell the stories of that place. So the Owens Thomas House and slave quarters, the and slave quarters was something that got added to the title within months of me getting there. That was something they were already in process of doing. I would also argue that their tours before I got there were already very much focused on telling the stories of the people who were enslaved there and the people who enslaved them. The Owens Thomas are the names of the people who were enslaving at that particular property. And so adding the and slave quarters, the intention, to my understanding, was to make it very clear to visitors what they would be learning about when they came to this house. Savannah has a lot of historic houses, and not all of them talk about slavery at the time that I was there, with the nuance that that they were doing at the Owens Thomas House and slave quarters. When I arrived, I was the only Black interpreter there. They had other Black interpreters there. And it was very much an interesting thing to be the only one and one of the few toward the end of my time there, who was actively telling the stories of these enslaved people while looking like the people who would have been enslaved in that particular space. It's very, very conscious thing and something that I have expanded on far more in my Twitter. If you go and find those particular threads, I can expand on that in the questions in particular. But what I want to focus on in terms of that job is the way that my job, the tours that we created at that space very much shifted through time in terms of what each particular historic interpreter was researching, what they were interested in, and ways that they adjusted and worked with the public and how they reacted to the public. So I noticed over a course of time that something that I tended to focus on in my tour, and it's a guided historic tour about 40 minutes through, starts in the slave quarters, goes to the courtyard, goes through all levels of the house and ends in the basement. My particular tour very much shifted toward the politics of the power that existed in that house. That's not new for any of the historic interpreters there. There's very much a way of doing that. But I describe it as one of the punchier rooms that I had in that tour was to go to the gentleman's library, which was on the second floor. And that's where I chose to talk about George Owens as a politician. Now, he was the mayor of Savannah for a short period of time. He was city alderman, sort of like a city councilman for much longer. And then we'll go on to the House of Representatives for a period of time. He has 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls, and a wife who all lived in that house with between 8 to 14 enslaved people at any moment in time. Between 8 to 14, most of them women, half girls under the age of 14. Now, that age thing I always mention in the beginning, and it was occasionally very shocking for visitors. But in the last 2 rooms, gentleman's library, and the last bedroom we go into, that's when I can really talk about his politics. He's not a particularly notable politician. People are often surprised that George Owens is not a famous person. It's not a notable name, but he is in the House of Representatives at the time of the gag rule of 1836. And in doing so, he's going to vote to keep the gag rule of 1836 to my memory. I haven't given this tour now in about 10 months, but to my memory, the gag rule of 1836 was about petitions to make DC anti-slavery, to keep slavery from occurring, slave trading, I believe, from occurring in DC. And they were abolitionists who were trying to petition this and trying to make progress on abolition across the country in a variety of ways. And this is one of the ways they were doing that. And they were bringing these petitions to Congress and reading them and trying to advocate with these. The gag rule of 1836 kept these petitions from being read at all, deliberately silencing of a particular voice in Congress that George Owens votes for and advocates that they shouldn't be read at all. There were a lot of Southern politicians saying, we don't need to be hearing about this. I don't want to hear about abolition. And George Owens is like, we shouldn't be here reading these petitions at all at this time. It was that's a paraphrasing though, obviously. And that's a silencing that is very specific and very notable. And then I could make the direct connection to, but keep in mind, to the visitors who are coming. A lot of Savannah visitors are there for the culture, the beautiful scenery, the trees, the ghost stories. There's a lot of things that bring people to Savannah. But then they come on tours like mine at this particular house and then hear about slaves for a period of time. And then I will tell them this about George Owens and the gag rule of 1836. We talked about all the other things that happened in the house. It's important to note for visitors that for people that George Owens votes for this, and he's one of 4 people who would be allowed to vote in this house at this time. His 3 sons would be able to be allowed to vote. His wife and 3 daughters would not be allowed to vote. None of the enslaved people would be allowed to vote. I could directly say, we don't think they probably would have voted in the same direction that he clearly did. That was a way I could advocate for the stories of people whose voices have very much been silenced in a lot of historic house museums, and had long before I got there were things that hadn't been actively talked about up until, I would say, new administration at the Owens Thomas and Slave Quarters and Telfair museums. And it's also important to note that these are stories that and histories that I was telling in Georgia in 2018. During a very notable election, I, as an interpreter, was encouraged not to be partisan, not to be as directly political, but I can talk through the history that I know exists, that we know definitively happened, and can make those connections. So I had visitors who would really comment on that in particular. And notably, I remember one small group, I had someone who asked me, had Stacey Abrams ever been on this tour? And I'm like, not to my knowledge. That'd have been exciting for me. But she hadn't. But the fact that visitors were making those connections through voting rights and voter suppression in those current times and how that long history exists. Speaking of silences, thinking about how a lot of people would come up to me at the end of my tour and ask me why they hadn't heard about slavery in Savannah up until this particular tour. And I would say, I don't know. Why haven't you asked about it before now? If you're going to other historic houses, going on other tours, it's worthwhile to ask them why you haven't heard about it before. I always found that very encouraging. Similarly to Angela, talking about relationships in terms of how being treated differently as the only person of color in the room. Having had those conversations with other Black interpreters before I got the job, I found it very pertinent to be as transparent with all of my experiences that I thought might be only me or not. With that occurred at this museum. I had a lot of people who would ask specifically me, how do you feel telling this history at this museum? And I would say, once I talked to my other coworkers, I would say it's interesting how few of my white coworkers get that particular question. And sometimes people would say, oh no, I would have asked. And I'm like, okay, you might have. But two, as a public historian, this is what happened. These are things that happen and these are people who dealt with it and this is what we know. It's important to tell these histories. But I can absolutely agree with the burden of sometimes feel. I would very much leave work and be chill for like a full rest of the day and spend about 8 hours talking about the importance and nuances of slavery and urban enslavement in particular in Savannah. The people who were there with that I would often call with vacation brain is very much a process and something worth dealing with and adjusting, but was very important. So I would argue that the advocacy that I was doing in that particular position had to do with bringing out the nuances in a lot of these conversations, talking about the various kinds of stories that exist in spaces like this. It's not just the beautiful house, it's who took care of the beautiful house. It's about the consequences of who's taking care of the beautiful house and what stories we have and what stories we don't and why that exists. It's important to recognize. We only had, to my memory, about few names of some of the enslaved people who were at the Owens Thomas House and Slave Quarters that we could track through time. We didn't have the names of all the enslaved people, but those we did, we tried to mention as much as we could in context with what we have, because it's important to say the names of the people to give them back to humanity. It was also very conscious of us to call them enslaved people and not slave, to give them that humanity, which is not new language, but is often surprising to people who aren't actively in this field in particular. So being able to talk about the history, bring the long conversations that exist with this history up throughout history and in conversation in public history, talking about how these are not new issues is a way that I would say that I've advocated throughout as well. And then excitingly, during the pandemic, also moved during the pandemic, agreed, do not recommend, got this job and moved to North Carolina and at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum, which I would argue is very much a site of political history, of education history. It is the first state historic site that is named for an African-American and a woman. And it was, Palmer Memorial Institute was a private Black boarding school during the Jim Crow era from about 1902 to 1971, graduating over 2,000 students, male and female. Over the course of those years, our alumni are very proud and trace their successes in life directly from this institution. Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown started the school when she was 19 years old, in addition to creating this very large space that taught art, college prep, various languages, mechanical skills, agricultural skills, entrepreneurial skills. These students had a very well-rounded education, domestic arts, a lot of etiquette being done here. And in the nuanced way of dealing with etiquette in terms of just being able to present your way forward in the best way possible. So a lot of educating is happening here. I often describe her as someone who advocated for her students both within the school and beyond, because she also is involved with a lot of suffrage organizations, a lot of political advocacy herself, both locally, statewide, and nationally. When giving tours, I like to talk about suffrage in particular, because, and especially last year during the centennial of the 19th Amendment, it was notable to talk about how this Black woman had created this school, but was also actively involved in very specific ways in voting registration and voting advocacy for all people. She's engaged in conversation with an A&T professor about how, no, Black women should get the right to vote. Just because Black men are being denied it right now doesn't mean Black women shouldn't also get the right to vote. She founds the Federation of Negro Women's Clubs in North Carolina, which connects all the Black women's clubs in North Carolina, which will send out a variety of information to allow many Black women in North Carolina to register to vote in 1920. But this is also these are also very subtle and nuanced advocacy things that she's doing at this time, that because if anything really came back to her, the school that she created with all these students would very much be a threat. So the way we look at the history and the resources that we have it's very specific and nuanced. But one of the exciting things is the advocacy that she does is is full of so much variety that there's a lot of things that we connect even further today. So before I can just pull it up on here. Let me do a quick screen share. My apologies. Yes, we'll do that. We'll do this quick screen share of an Instagram post that we would put up shortly before I arrived here, or not too long after the George Floyd protests were really occurring. This is a direct quote from Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown. I will read it because it's not super great to see. Yet to you who are silent when you know of the crimes committed against the innocent, the unfair deeds, etc., to you who have power to change or make such legislation that will establish fair play and justice for all people, to you who through the practice of Christian religion can change the tide of affairs, we are appealing for understanding sympathy, which is a direct from her letter from her. And I think I had a second one. Nope, that's just a map. We are not bitter. We are wary of having patience preached to us. We are not disillusioned. We know what we want to realize, that they are slaves to fear who keep their feet on the necks of the darker people struggling to rise. A excerpt from a speech that she gave. It's important to me that the stuff that she is saying at this time is not about history that is super far in the past. It is in fact of things that are very much occurring today. She talks about criminal justice. She talks about education. She talks about, she fights anti-lynching, she fights for anti-lynching legislation. She fights for voting rights. I would say one of the more notable things that happened while I've been here the last 10 months that we were able to do is we got a call and asked if we were interested in being an early voting site. And we said, absolutely. We would love to have people on site voting, especially given Dr. Brown's interest and work with suffrage. It makes a lot of sense to be that space. We are also notable for me to mention in terms of that is we are in Gibsonville, North Carolina, but we are in Sedalia, which is a much smaller area, very rural, very Black, but very small within Gibsonville. So when we opened the first day as an early voting site, for those who are watching the many news going on the first day early voting was happening across the United States, it was very busy. We had over the 2.5 weeks that we had early voting occurring on site, we had over 10,000 people come to the site to early vote. Several who had never been there before, several who were voting for the very first time, voting for whatever candidate they were. We had a system that it was mostly run by the Board of Elections, but we were out there talking to them if they needed help with things around there. There's so much that we were able to do, and in terms of just making it open. It's important to mention that as a state employee, I am not supposed to be advocating in a very specific way, but the history that is being done and was done at the site is something that I can highlight, which is an advocacy in of itself, just without going too far, as my employers would say, I would say. But in terms of highlighting this history and this nuance, it's important. And it's the thing that I think brings a lot of people, allows people to make those connections between the past and the present. I will tell one more story and then I will finish up for questions. I gave 3 Girl Scouts, 3 Black Girl Scouts a tour several weeks ago. It wasn't the last tour I gave, but it was something I held very dear to my heart because kids are so much fun. And in giving them the tour of Canary Cottage, which was the house of Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown. I bring them to the dining room with their mothers there, and I'm talking about etiquette, and I'm talking about how it's not just about which fork and spoon you use, it's about presenting yourself in the best way that possible. And then talking to the little girls, I'm like, keep in mind, when we're talking about this, when this is a school and she's teaching things like this is the segregated South. Lynchings are still very much happening. Jim Crow is very much in effect. And this is really her teaching her students how to best protect themselves in the best way they can and giving them the education to go and do so. And I had a little girl, and it's the funniest thing whenever kids do it. She said she didn't have a question, she had a comment. And her comment was, it's interesting how that's not that different from the way we're being taught to deal with people today. And I'm like, you're not wrong. And the connection she was able to make from that Some of that is absolutely her parents and her teachers making those connections and bringing her to places like our site who will tell her these things. But she would definitely made that connection on her own in the tour between a school that was created in 1902 and etiquette that often, if you read it, will sometimes sound silly to you, but making that direct connection to lives that exist today and the way people exist today, it's so crucial. And I'll finish up there.
Awesome. Thank you, Lacey. Yeah, it is so important to think about, like, how can you advocate in these spaces, and like by sharing, kind of filling in those silences of people who have been historically silenced. That's such a good way to do it, especially when you're in an institution or working for an institution where you can't be like overtly political, like using that space as a voting site or something. That's fantastic. And I love that anecdote at the end that really connects to Holly's talk as well. Making kind of these subtle connections, showing the nuances of history, and then like kids make that leap themselves. They're like, oh, this is very relevant. But yeah, thank you all. This was a fantastic panel. And I've learned so much. I think there are a lot of threads that we can tease out and have a conversation about. We have about 25 minutes. So I will open the floor to questions in the Q&A, and I'll just read them, and then the panelists can respond. So our first question is to all of the panelists: as you do history, do you feel like an activist? Like, is that how you would define yourself or characterize your work?
I can go first. I would argue that I'm an activist in trying to fill silences and trying to explain the long history of issues that existed beyond when people often think about them. I think if I'm trying to make people's voices heard as a historian, I'm being an activist. Whether other people might disagree, there are just as many people who are like, you're being probably too activist in making these connections today. So I would just easily accept that as a title.
I would agree. I mean, I think that the very act of being a public historian is that history is active, and you are being an active participant in this historical process, as opposed to, as I have learned on the other side of being a doctoral student, being accused of being presentist. And this belief that real history is in the past, and we are only just benign interpreters of what might have happened. But this is why I really enjoy being a public historian, because I don't think that it's something that's benign and that we are just, the people through which the past comes forth. Like, I feel that I am very active in, as Lacey said, like, the silences, and also, again, like building these connections between communities that in academic history are often not connected. So like, for example, having worked on a Chinatown site, having worked on a state historic preservation site where I was the researcher on Mexican immigrants and laborers in Southern California. And then I get to my doctoral program and they're just like, but you said you wanted to study African-American history. And I was like, well, yes, but this also has relevancy to the kinds of questions that I'm interested in, and the kinds of communities and the kinds of, like, I think it's all like a braided story of history, and not just, you need to separate out these different threads. Like, I think that they all are connected. And again, my experience with being in museums where the demographics have shifted drastically from when the museum was founded has made me all the more aware of history being active, and that my presence does make history, and being a historian, being an activist.
I'll add to that question. Jed and I together edit Utah Historical Quarterly, and so we have some hand, obviously, in which articles are published. Of course, there's the whole process, but I would say the things, the subjects that are dear to my heart, or subjects that need to be explored more, yeah, of course, we're gonna nurture those more. maybe not nurture those more, but African-American history, any BIPOC history, we're going to really push and talk to those authors. And, you know, I have a child with disabilities. So if somebody says some disability history, you know, I'm going to be interested, and I'm going to push on that. My own current project, you know, something I've struggled a lot with, I thought about talking about for this panel, deals with a woman who was really involved with the political far right in the 30s and 40s. And as I've written stuff, I've gone back and I'm like, Holly, you're not being objective. And I'm like, how can I be objective? You know, what am I supposed to do? I was reading a lot of this anti-Semitic stuff that was being published in the 30s. I was reading it this summer, and summer of 2020, and after a while I threw my hands up, like, I actually can't do this. So yeah, there's it what Jed said, the professional and the personal ethics have to be together. So I'll just echo that.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, I hesitate to use that title for myself as activist, just because I well, we won't necessarily get into that, but I feel like I do definitely feel like the work that I do as a historian can make a difference, and has made a difference, and should be pushed in that direction. I mean, I mentioned environmental history. Holly mentioned the kinds of articles that we privilege, or that we choose to really go after and develop, are those in which we feel will make a difference for the study of Utah history. And it strikes me that we all, as historians, can choose the topics that we decide to write about. As William Cronin has written in his article, Place for Stories, if you've read that, talks about where you begin your story makes all the difference in the world in terms of how that narrative arc plays out, and the moral then that can be attached to the stories that we tell. And I think it's important then to carefully select the stories. It's important to scrutinize where we're beginning and ending our stories, you know, who we're leaving in, who we're leaving out, because the history is all around us, and it's just a matter of noticing that it's there, that we so I think that's where I am on that particular question, is seeing a familiar history, but noticing those individuals, those groups who have been traditionally marginalized from the narrative is really super important.
Thanks, everybody. All right, so our next question from Lydia is, are there any resources to use if an administration is against advocacy that we try to implement at historic sites and museums? Good one.
I'm sure there are. I mean, it's very tricky as a state employee to try to talk about things like this, because where I am in my position, I am not encouraged to advocate for my site specifically. Our support group is tasked with doing that specifically, but knowing that our site is about political history, I have been encouraged to make those connections from the past to the present. But if it doesn't take a hard search on Twitter or any social media to find a disgruntled public historian who wants to do more in terms of advocacy and is being kept from in some fashion. There are a lot of locked accounts along Twitter of which I've seen people say very specific things about specific institutions who are trying to keep things from happening. I'm sure there are institutions, I'm just paraphrasing, but I'm sure there are institutions that have locked social media accounts, who have certain people running their social media accounts in a particular way. At my last institution, one of the consistent ways we learned about how visitors felt about the historic site and the tours is from reviews. So we'd look at Google reviews, and we'd look at another popular review site that I can't think of the name of right now. And we would read them aloud. And if people got mentioned by name, we would talk about it and we would discuss whether that was a fair thing or not. But we, as individual historic interpreters, didn't respond to that. We had a marketing department for Telfair museums that responded to those. So when I did a presentation at NCPH 2 years ago in Connecticut, talking about how visitors responded to my tours. And in getting research for that, I definitely asked my immediate supervisor in the marketing department, send me the reviews in which people were clearly upset with my tour because of my race. And those were fascinating. They are fascinating in terms of the way people responded to them. And I genuinely feel grateful that I did not have to respond to those. But imagine I had a less supportive institution who made me respond to those or made me consistently read those. Like, I was curious enough that I would often check on my own, but if that was like actively part of my job to interact with that, I don't know if I would have gone into creating tours that ended up talking about voting rights in the same way that I ended up doing. So I'll say that my particular institution right now wants me to be very careful as far as things that are partisan as a state employee. And that's very fair because I'm trying to reach a great deal of people. But but the way that I tend to talk about advocacy and the history that exists here comes together so naturally that it doesn't really affect me in that way. I don't know if that last part made sense.
Yeah, that was good. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? All right. So the next question from Amira that I saw was, she writes, Jedediah made a point about how your personal ethics are a part of public history, and inspired by the museum that Angela was talking about in California that did not prepare her for the questions or reactions she might have received in her position. And Lacey also covered this a bit in her presentation. What do you do when you work for an institution that does not share your personal ethics and does not want your advocacy? How do you reconcile with that dissonance, and what steps can you take? It's a good one.
I'll just say it's very much related to the last question. It seems really important to part of being an advocate or an activist means being willing to swim in waters of controversy, right? And so when you do that, it seems important to me to defend your methodology and your profession. So, and your process, the way you get to where we go from A to B or whatever we're doing in historical enterprise, some of that may be quite controversial to individuals, to administrators, to audiences, and clients. But being able to defend that history encompasses more than just what we think it might, or what the public might think it encompasses, showing how questions that historians ask can address real contemporary problems, maybe not in the ways that other disciplines can, but certainly in our own unique ways. So being able to defend that methodology seems important to me. And I'll just mention that, you know, we had a manuscript come in that which the author was very critical of a founding state member, right? So, and that even made the argument that such memorials or statues to this individual ought to be dismantled. And so what's our response to something like that that would be very, very controversial in our state is actually, let's run with this. Let's create a forum or a blog series on historical memorials and have a range of perspectives so that we can actually enter this debate, showing all the various viewpoints, including those that might be extremely controversial in our state. And I just think that's a way to break down some walls. It's also a way for us to advance perspectives that otherwise wouldn't be there.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that one? Multi-part question.
I can, since I was mentioned, and I was gonna laugh because in both institutions where I've had the same problem, it was the result of being very, very underfunded. And also the first position, I was entry level. The second position, I was the actual manager of the site. But at the same time, funding was such a huge issue that I was met with a lot of resistance, because that would mean allocating more funds for this position than they had originally intended. So if in a perfect world, I would have been able to at least gather a better board and a better volunteer force. But because of the lack of funds, it was so difficult to do more than I could do when I was able to show up and for my hours that I was allocated each week. But in general, like it just really gave me, I guess, a little bit of a wake up call in realizing like, oh, this is something that we are not taught when we are taking these museum studies classes, these public history classes, and it's something that we need to be aware of, even as students, that funding issues, stakeholder issues, city bureaucracy, and leadership is always going to be something that you need to navigate and learn to navigate around. And a lot of times you're not going to win. And that just means that you need to take the battle to your next position, and also to talk to the people coming behind you, like, hey, you need to figure out like what are the lines that you're going to draw when you get into these positions, and how do you feel like you're going to be best served to navigate these difficult conversations and these difficult stakeholders and these difficult moments that are not going to harm you.
Right, that's actually pretty relevant to our next question. Anne wrote, especially in the currently fraught political environment that's very polarized right now, have you had encounters where you have gotten angry or combative pushback that has made you uncomfortable and been especially challenging to navigate?
I could dive into this. As someone who was at my previous position talking about slavery in a town where I would describe many visitors coming as tourists who had a lot of vacation brain and didn't necessarily want to hear about the nuances and political ramifications about the antebellum urban slavery environments, I've gotten resistance. I often am concerned that I talk about it too much, because I had far more good interactions than bad, but in terms of uncomfortableness and resistance, I definitely had both of those. I noticed, and I was able to talk about it with the other two Black people who came in a bit after me, that we all seem to have this experience where after you tell this story, this interpretation, for some reason, there were a lot of white women who really wanted to put their hands on us, just like put their hands on our shoulder, offer a hug like immediately. And I'm not that touchy a person, I'll say, especially if I just gave you a tour for 40 minutes as an employee. We're not close enough to do that. And yet it came all the time. And in talking about this with my coworkers, I had a few people who were older and who had been giving tours there for longer, wanted to know why I was upset at this. And I was just saying I didn't want to be touched. It was just a 40-minute tour. I'm about to give another one. We don't need to exchange anything. And it's kind of, but that there was an uncomfortableness there. I think the way I tend to think about it in my head is that they were uncomfortable. They wanted to know if I was uncomfortable and trying to relieve their own uncomfort and what they perceived as my uncomfortableness. I wasn't uncomfortable until they tried to touch me. And that's something I don't think they noticed or recognized as visitors who were just there for a period of time. I will say, for people who were resistant, I had a lot of people just not believe me when I said things, which was fascinating. In particular, I remember in one of the last streams, I talk about the relationship between the enslaved people and the children of the enslavers. And I developed a line where I talked about how what they feel between each other is not a real love, because none of the enslavers' children will go on to free any of these enslaved people. They will actually continue to want them. We have evidence of them in far as like the wills, saying for this particular enslaved woman who essentially raised them and slept next to many of their beds, Jamie, slept next to many of their beds. would often consider what they actually put in the will. They wanted her to continue to be enslaved by their children and beyond. They wanted to keep her in the family. So I often would say in the tour, like, what we're talking about is not love, not a real love. And I've had many people be like, no, they must have loved each other. And the answer I began to develop is, what kind of love is it if you want to continue enslaving this person, continue to be owned by this person? It has to be a toxic kind of thing. And that's something that I had to be very careful about how to say. I had a white coworker, Steve, who's not here at the moment, but who would say that, and he could look directly in their eyes and sort of say it. I had to be very careful how I approached that and how I understood those audiences there, because they would react to me saying that differently. Because many people absolutely believe, no, the enslaved people and the enslavers loved each other. That's why they were often buried near each other, and all of these things that they put upon. And there's no evidence to say they did or didn't. And if they did, what kind of a love really is that? And people would occasionally be very resistant to the idea that this wasn't love. And depending on how my audience was for that particular tour, often the audience would be resistant to the person who was resisting this thought. I had a woman say, no, there's so much love in this world. And everyone else in the group turned and looked at her like, what are you talking about? They were enslaved. Have you not been paying attention this whole time? And that's always a fascinating thing to witness, to like get them on their side and that kind of thing. And that was, I had that job between 2017 to 2020, a period in 2020. So it was during a lot of this time in which there was a lot of political upheaval. There was, in Georgia in particular, was going through quite a bit of movement. I was not in Georgia during this during the last election, but during the state governor's election, when people were really paying attention to Georgia, it came up and it was interesting. There were a lot of, so yeah, there's been resistance.
Thanks, Lacey. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
I think I can say yes. We had a situation that made me extremely uncomfortable and got a lot of pushback and had to talk to my therapist about, but I can't talk about it. So, it happened. But state government, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the thing. Some of these things, like when I was listening to all of you talk about this, the fact that we're bringing our ethics into our work and our advocacy, it's exhausting. It's exhausting in a lot of ways. It's just like never stops. So we have time for this final question from Maureen. How do you take steps to be or not to be a gatekeeper in your advocacy? It's a nice question to finish with.
What do you mean by gatekeeper?
Yeah. Like maybe as though we were trying to control the narrative, or the public historian trying to control the narrative as well as the institution. If you could clarify in the Q&A, Maureen. Or maybe just trying to negotiate who controls this narrative. Is it that, I mean, that's maybe one of the things I've been thinking about a lot as you all have been speaking. Is it these institutions? Is it us as historians? Is it the community who have different identities in these histories? Who controls it? Who should control it? How do we, advocate for different communities without speaking on behalf of them?
So the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum has a lot of stakeholders, and a great variety of stakeholders that I'm always very proud to mention. We have the we have the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Historical Foundation, which originally was an organization of people who wanted to turn this former school, into a historic site. They were advocated for it to be bought by the state at that particular time. We have an alumni association of former students here who are very active and very excited to see more happen here. We've had a lot of interns and volunteers and people who do programming here and people who see their stories here. We have a lot of city councilmen for the city council space of Sedalia is literally across the street from our site, as well as the post office. A lot of schools came here for field trips. I'm saying all this to say, I don't think I'm in charge of this history. I've been here 10 months as the site manager. I'm very fortunate and very excited to be here. This is not my history to decide. This, I'm excited for when we have more alumni come here. I met my first alumni this past weekend who will tell me their history with this school, what it was like to go to a private Black boarding school in North Carolina in the 1960s and 1970s. That's an experience I didn't have. And that's experience I will not have, but I'm excited to hear them tell me about it. The Historical Foundation are people who wanted to turn this into a historic site in the late 1980s, early 1990s. I've never created a historic site. The process of doing that is beyond me. I'm amazed I'm able to somewhat run one at the moment. So I think that I often make fun of the very buzzword phrase shared authority as a very conscious thing and self-deprecating, but also very lovingly. I really feel like this is a site and a space where I feel that the most, because I don't own this story. It's not even, it's Charlotte's story, but it's also the story of the teachers she hired and brought, the students that went here, the groundskeepers. There's so many people who have ownership of the story with me that I'm delighted to just share it as opposed to be in charge of it. So if someone comes and says, I don't particularly care about her suffrage history, I don't particularly care about her education history, I want to hear about the sports that existed on the site. Tell me about the boys' baseball team in the 1920s that were state championships. I'd be like, that's perfectly valid. Please tell, I would love to tell you about that. I would love to help you tell me about that if you know more about it than I do. I feel very confident and excited to share.
Awesome, thank you. We're about out of time. Any final remarks, closing remarks? I think kind of going out on that note about like sharing and shared authority really speaks to a lot of what we have been talking about. All right, well, thank you to our audience for coming today, and thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your expertise. And I hope we can find a way to kind of continue these conversations. I hate when it just ends after a roundtable and it's like, oh, we did the conference. So maybe we can find an organic way that's not overburdensome to continue our conversations and kind of share resources about how we can advocate as historians. But thank you all and enjoy the weekend and hopefully nice weather wherever you are.